The heat inside the Willow Fork livestock hall pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck, and 200 men, who had never once removed their hats for Della Renner, now held those hats against their chests and waited on her word. Outside, the June sun hammered the packed clay of 3 counties into brick. Inside, the auctioneer's stand stood empty, and every rancher and horse trader who had spent a dozen years laughing at the small woman with the calloused hands stood pressed shoulder to shoulder, because their whole way of living had come down to a decision that was hers alone to make. She stood on the low platform in a plain gray dress gone pale at the seams, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not need to. Every animal they had left to work, every mount that could still be trusted to carry a man across broken country in the killing dry, traced its blood back to a single crooked colt she had bought for $28 when nobody in the valley would have given a dime. They waited on her judgment now. But the true judgment had been rendered years before, quietly, by the animals themselves and by the woman who had bothered to watch them. And everything that happened in that hot hall was only the world catching up to a verdict already written in flesh and bone and temper. To understand what she chose, you have to go back to the day she arrived with everything she owned, lashed under a canvas tarp, and a fold of bills that felt thinner every time she counted it. She came into the valley 11 years before, that reckoning in the spring of a year when the grass came up thick and lying promising more than the country ever meant to keep. She was 31 then, a widow of 2 years, and she came with the money her husband had left her, which came to $410 after the burial and the debts, and with that money she meant to buy a place and make a stand. What she found she could afford was a 40-acre patch out past the Hollis Road that the locals called the Slough, a low bottom of poor drainage and rushes that had beaten 3 families before her and driven them off, broke or dead. The house was 2 rooms with a stove that smoked. The barn leaned like a drunk against the prevailing wind. She paid $320 for the land and the buildings, which left her $90 against the whole hard business of living, and the men at the feed store in Willow Fork gave her about a season before she would come crawling back to sell. A woman working ground alone, they said, was a joke that told itself. They said it where she could hear it, and she made no answer, because she had learned already that being right is its own kind of reply, and that a person who wastes breath defending herself has none left for the work. She needed stock, and stock cost money she did not have. So she went to the dispersal sale the week after she took the deed, the sale where the Colvin estate was being broke up and scattered after old man Colvin died, owing everybody. The good horses went first and went high, snapped up by the outfits that could pay, and Della stood at the back with her $90 and watched her chances thin. She had grown up around horses, had a knowledge of them in her hands that no book gives, but knowledge without capital buys nothing at an auction. And then near the end, when the crowd had already turned to leave and the auctioneer's voice had gone tired, they led out a yearling colt that made the whole hall laugh out loud. He was a poor-looking thing, that colt. He was a dark liver bay, gone rough in the coat, ribby from a winter of neglect, and he came down the alley at a hitching, uneven walk that told every man there his story before a word was spoken. The right foreleg had been hurt in the wire as a foal, and it had healed crooked at the knee, so that he set the foot down with a little dip and a hesitation, a lameness that would never leave him. A lame horse is a dead horse on a working ranch, or ought to be, and the auctioneer barely bothered. "He'll never carry a saddle," somebody called, and somebody else said he'd make dog meat cheaper than most, and the laughter rolled around the hall the way laughter does when men are glad it is not aimed at them. But Della had been watching the colt the whole slow way down the alley, and she had seen what the laughing men had not troubled to see. She saw that the crooked leg was old and settled and no longer sore, a healed thing and not a wound. She saw that, despite the fear and the noise, the colt did not fight, the lead did not spook, did not roll his eye white, but stepped along with a settled patience, and that when a boy near the rail dropped a bucket with a bang, the colt only flicked an ear and stood, She saw the deep slope of the shoulder under the poor coat, and the clean, broad quarters and the honest square set of the head. And she saw the eye, which was large and dark and calm as still water, the eye of an animal that thinks before it moves. She knew that a leg heals, but a temperament is born, and that you can breed away a crooked knee in a single generation, but you cannot breed a bad mind into a good one. Nobody would bid. She raised her hand and said, in a voice that carried in the sudden hush, $28. And there was a beat of silence, and then a fresh gust of laughter, and the auctioneer knocked him down to her, gladly. Glad to be rid of him, and a man behind her said, loud enough to carry, well, the fool and her money. That was the phrase that followed her home and followed her for years, the fool and her money, said with a grin at the feed's door and the church steps and the crossing where the roads met. She let it ride. She led the colt the 6 miles out to the slough on foot, because she had no wagon to spare him a ride, and he limped along beside her the whole way. And she named him nothing at first, because a name is a kind of promise, and she did not yet know what she was promising. That first evening she stood him in the leaning barn and ran her hands down every inch of him, the crooked knee and the good bone below it, the clean joints, the deep heart girth, and she did her arithmetic out loud to the darkening barn. She had $62 left. She had 40 acres of poor bottom. She had a lame colt that could never be sold for saddle work. And she had the one thing none of the laughing men had bothered to price, which was time and eyes willing to use it. A poor hand counts what a thing costs, she thought. A good hand counts what it can make. She did not yet know how she would make anything of him. But she had learned from her husband's dying that the world does not hand you a fair deal, and that you take the crooked thing nobody wants and you learn its nature, because a thing understood is worth 10 things merely owned. The first summer nearly broke her, the way it broke everyone who tried the slough. The bottom flooded with the spring rains, and then baked hard and cracked when the rains quit, and the rushes came back thicker than any grass. And Della learned that the ground she had bought was the ground nobody wanted for the same reason. The colt was the colt nobody wanted, because it was hard and it was work, and it did not give itself up to the impatient. She dug drainage by hand with a spade until her palms split and healed into leather. She planted a garden that the standing water drowned and planted it again higher. She lived on beans and cornmeal and the milk of one poor cow, and counted her dollars down to 50, and then to 40, and then to 31. And there came a night in that first autumn when she sat on the stoop with the ledger in her lap. She had figured it every way, and the sums came up short. She thought that night plainly and without drama that the men had been right, and that she would fail and be gone by the thaw, and she wept a little quietly, the way a person weeps who has no one to hear. And it was the colt that pulled her back. She heard him in the dark, moving in the barn, and she went out with the lantern, because a horse restless at night can mean colic. And she found him standing over the poor cow, who had gone down sick with something, and he was not troubled but attentive, standing guard the way a good horse will. And when Della came in, he turned his calm dark eye on her, and lipped at her sleeve. She stayed with the cow through the night, and the cow lived, and in the small hours, leaning on the crooked colt's shoulder, Della felt the first stir of a stubborn hope, small as a coal, and she banked it and kept it low and told no one. She named him then, at last. She called him Steady because that was the truest thing about him, and because a name spoken in a lonely barn at 3 in the morning is a bargain struck between two creatures that the daylight world need never know about. The old man came in the second year, and he changed everything, though it took her a long time to understand how much. His name was Anders Voll, and he had come from the old country as a young man and settled a small tidy place on the ridge above the slough, and he was regarded in the valley with a mixture of respect and unease, the way people regard someone who knows things they have forgotten. He was past 70, spare and slow, with hands that had gentled horses on 2 continents. He rode down to the slough one morning on a plain sound mare and sat his saddle at Della's gate, and watched her working steady in the poor bottom, not riding him, for she never rode him, but leading him at liberty, through the rushes and over the drainage ditches she had dug. And she noticed that the old man did not laugh. He watched a long time. Then he got down stiffly and walked into the field and stood looking at the colt's crooked leg, and then at the colt's eye, and he was quiet. And at last he said, in his soft, deliberate cadence, "They laughed at this one." It was not a question. Della said they did. The old man reached and laid his hand on Steady's neck, and the colt stood for it, and the old man said, "The ground remembers what the plow forgets, and it speaks low, so you have got to bend down to hear it." She did not fully understand him then. He said, "This leg, it is nothing. A leg is the least of a horse." He tapped his own temple. And this he said, and laid his palm flat between the colt's calm eyes. "This you cannot buy, and you cannot beat into them, and you cannot breed it out once you have got it." He looked at her a while. "You have got an eye," he said, "for a woman they call a fool." Then he told her the thing that turned her whole notion around, the practical key that reframed the crooked colt from a burden into a fortune. "Do not ride him," the old man said. "He cannot carry. That leg will not last a hard day under a man. But he does not need to carry. Put him to the mares. A horse like this, calm in the head, honest in the bone, he does not need good legs to give what he has got. He gives it in his get. You breed him, and you breed that mind into every foal, and the leg you leave behind in one generation." He mounted his sound mare again and looked down at her. "In the old country," he said, "we did not throw away the crooked apple tree that bore sweet. We took the seed." Then he rode home. She had not thought of it. It seems simple, now laid out plain. But she had been so schooled by the valley's certainty that a lame horse was a worthless horse that she had never once considered that Steady's worth was not in what he could do, but in what he could pass down, that his crooked knee was a fence around a treasure that kept other men out. She had no mares to speak of, only one aging plow mare of no particular breeding. But she bred that mare to Steady that season. And she went to a neighbor, 2 Ridges, over whose husband had died, and who had a pair of decent mares she could not afford to keep, and Della traded a winter's labor for the use of them, and she bred those 2. And she settled in to wait, because breeding is the slowest arithmetic there is. 11 months to a foal, and 3 years more before that foal can prove what it is, and a person who wants a quick answer should never take it up. But Della had time. Time was the one thing the laughing man had left her. The boy came the 3rd year. His name was Tomas, and he was the youngest of the Kettle family, who lived hard on a dry claim north of the slough, and were poorer even than Della. And Tomas was 9 that first summer he appeared, a silent, watchful child, who drifted down along the ditches and stood at the fence for hours, saying nothing. Della let him be. She had learned that some creatures come to you sideways and must not be reached for. After a week the boy climbed the fence and stood nearer, and after 2 weeks he was carrying water without being asked. And after a month he had names for all 3 foals that had dropped that spring, gangly long-legged things that followed their dams through the rushes, and the names he gave them stuck. He never mocked her, not once, and in a valley where every grown man had a joke ready, the plain acceptance of a silent 9-year-old was a thing Della found she leaned on more than she would have admitted. Thomas saw the sense in her method the way children see the sense in things, before the world teaches them what they are supposed to think. He would stand by Steady and lean his whole small weight against the horse's shoulder. And Steady would stand for him unmoving, and the boy would say, blunt as children are, "He's the best one, and they're all too stupid to know it." And Della would say, "They'll know it. She said it the way you say a thing you have decided to make true. The first foals grew." And here, the slow miracle began to show itself, invisible to the town and plain as day to the 2 who watched. They came out sound of leg every one, the crooked knee left behind in a single generation exactly as the old man had promised, but they came out with their sire's mind. And that was the thing nobody had priced. They were calm. They did not spook at flapping canvas, or a gunshot, or a snake underfoot. They stood to be shod without a fight. They learned a task and kept it. A green rider could sit them and come home whole. On the open range, where a man's life can hang on whether his horse loses its head at the wrong moment. This was worth more than speed, or size, or a fashionable color, and Della knew it, and she kept it low and banked, like a coal under ash, and she said nothing to anyone. She sold the plowmare's colt at 3, quietly, to a widow woman down the valley who needed a safe horse and could not afford a dear one, and the widow came back within the month telling everyone who would listen that she had never in her life owned such a horse, that it minded like a dog and never took a fright, and a seed of talk began, small, dismissed. The fool and her lucky accident, Della bred more. She took her small profits, and did not spend them on comfort, but on mares, plain, sound, useful mares that other outfits undervalued, and she put every one of them to steady, and the crooked colt nobody had wanted stood at the head of a growing band in the poor bottom of the slough and got sound, calm foals year on year. She drained more of the bottom, and the grass came in where the rushes had been, because she had learned to work with the ground instead of against it, to let the water go where the water wanted, and plant where the water left. And the old man rode down now and then, and looked over the fence, and nodded and said little, which from him was praise. The valley still laughed, but the laughter had gone a little thin at the edges, a little uncertain, the way laughter goes when the joke keeps not dying the way a joke is supposed to. Now there was in Willow Fork a man named Royce Sutter, and he was the near hand of a thing bigger than himself, an agent and buyer for the Merchant and Cattleman's Land and Stock Consortium, an outfit of Eastern money that had been buying up the valley piece by piece, grazing leases and water rights and whole, failed ranches, consolidating the country into one great holding under a distant board of men who had never smelled the dust. Sutter was smooth and well-dressed and warm in the way a thing is warm that has learned warm as a tool, and he made it his business to know every animal and acre in 3 counties, because the consortium meant in time to own them all. He had come to the slough twice in the early years to make Della an offer on the whole crooked business, the land and the lame horse and the ragged little band, an insultingly low offer dressed up as a kindness, a hand extended to a woman alone who surely wanted rescuing. Both times she had declined him with a single plain sentence. The second time he had let the warmth slip a moment and said, "You will regret refusing charity," and she had said, "I've had charity, it cost too much." And he had gone away with a smile that did not reach his eyes. By the time the 5th year turned into the 6th, the talk about Renner horses had grown past the point where Sutter could ignore it, and the outside world took its notice in the only language the valley truly respected, which was hard money paid by a stranger who owed nobody a favor. A trail contractor named Bell came through from beyond the far range, a hard, practical man moving a great herd of cattle north, and needing mounts for his crew that would hold their heads in a stampede and a river crossing and would not lame out on rough ground, and somebody at the Willow Fork feed store, meaning it half as a joke, sent him out to the fool at the slough. Bell came, and Bell watched Della's 3-year-old's work, and Bell did not care in the slightest what anyone in the valley thought, because he was a stranger judging the thing by its true quality and not by its reputation. He put his roughest rider on the greenest colt and fired a pistol into the air, and the colt only turned its calm eye toward the sound, and stood, and Bell took off his hat and scratched his head and said, "I have bought 1,000 horses, and I never saw the like." He bought 9 head that day at $60 apiece, which was a working man's wage for half a year each, $540 pressed into Della Renner's calloused hand, and he said he would take every sound colt she could raise, every year, forever. And he shook her hand as an equal. And the news of that sale went through Willow Fork like a grass fire. That was the first true vindication, the outside validator paying premium coin, and it changed the color of the laughter for good. Men who had grinned now came out to the slough on quiet pretexts to look over the fence at the crooked stallion and his sound, calm get. And they went away thoughtful. Sutter came again, and this time the offer was not charity, but consolidation. A large sum, a genuinely large sum, for the stallion alone, for steady, because Sutter and the distant board had understood at last that the value was not in any single horse, but in the blood, in the ability to make more, and they meant to own the source. He named a figure that made Della's breath catch, more money than she had ever seen or dreamed of, enough to leave the hard slough forever and live soft the rest of her days. She stood at her gate a long while, with the crooked old horse behind her, grown gray now about the muzzle, and gentle as ever. And she thought of the arithmetic she had done that first desperate night. A poor hand counts what a thing costs. A good hand counts what it can make. And she understood that Sutter was offering her a great deal of what a thing costs in order to take from the valley forever what it could make. She said, "He's not for sale." Sutter's warmth slipped again. "Everything is for sale," he said. "It is only a question of the number. And you are a woman alone, getting no younger. And this country is going to belong to the consortium one way or another, the easy way or the other way." Were. And there it was, the veiled threat, under the smile. And Della only said, "You'd best go now." And he went, and this time the smile was gone before he reached his buggy. The pressure came then in 3 tightening waves, the way such pressure always comes when patient greed decides it has waited long enough. First came the rumors, seated quietly at the feed store, and the church that the Renner horses were freakish, that the calmness was a sickness, a dullness of the brain that would turn one day and get a man killed, that the blood was tainted from the crooked sire and would breed monsters given time. Della answered none of it, and Bell the contractor came back for his yearly 9 head and paid his gold, and the rumors withered against that plain fact. Second came the squeeze on the leases, for the consortium held the grazing rights to much of the open country now, and word went out that Renner stock would no longer be run on consortium range, a real blow, for Della's band had grown past what her 40 acres could feed, and she had leaned on the open commons like everyone else. She sold down her numbers, kept only the best mares, tightened her arithmetic, and held. Third and last came the matter of the water. The consortium moved to control the head of the valley's water, the streams and the seeps that fed the whole country in the dry months, filing claims and building the beginnings of a dam at the Narrows. And Sutter let it be known, warmly, reasonably, that in a dry year the water would go first to those who had been cooperative. It was not merely threatening Della now. He was gathering the whole valley into his fist, and the valley, foolish and short-sighted and afraid, let him because the grass was still coming up green and lying, promising more than the country meant to keep. Then the dry came. It came in the 7th year of Della's stand, and it came like the open door of a furnace. A heat that stood over the valley and would not move week on week, until the green-lying grass burnt to brittle straw, and the seeps dried to cracked mud, and the streams shrank to strings of warm-standing pools, and then to nothing. The country that had beaten 3 families off the slough now turned and showed the whole valley what it truly was under the pretty seasons, and the ranchers who had run great herds on the open consortium range found their cattle dying by the score, and their fine, deep-bred saddle horses, the fast-blooded, nervous horses they had prized, going to pieces under the strain, laming out on the iron ground, spooking and running themselves to death in their thirst, useless in the hard, patient work of moving stock to water, and hauling and hanging on through a crisis. And Della Renner's horses did not break the blood of the crooked Colt held. Her sound, calm, even-tempered horses put their heads down and did the work, walked the iron ground without laming, hauled water without balking, carried desperate men across broken country without losing their minds, endured. The despised method proved out in the one test that finally mattered, the test of catastrophe, and the valley began, slowly in its extremity, to understand what it had laughed at for 7 years, and Sutter's hand closed. With the water short and the streams gone, the consortium's dam at the Narrows and the seeps it controlled became the whole life of the valley, and Sutter set the price of that water, and it was ruinous, and men who had mocked Della now mortgaged what the drought had left them to buy water from the Eastern Board at whatever Sutter named. He had them. The catastrophe he had not made, but had prepared for, had delivered the valley into his fist exactly as he had promised, and he walked the streets of Willow Fork, now with the warmth all gone, plain and cold, a man collecting. But the drought that made Sutter's water dear had done one other thing that neither Sutter nor the valley had reckoned. On the poor low bottom of the slough, the very ground nobody had wanted, the ground of bad drainage that Della had spent 11 years learning to read, the water had not entirely failed. For in learning to work with that wet ground instead of against it, in tracing over the years exactly where the water wanted to go, and gather and hide, Della had come to know the one thing about the slough that made it worth more in a drought than all the fine high ground in the county, which was that beneath the poor bottom lay a shallow, steady underflow. A slow sheet of water moving underground toward the low place that never entirely dried, because it did not depend on the rain of any single year, but on the deep, slow gathering of many. And years before, in a good year, with the little money the outside sales had brought, Della had done a quiet thing. She had hired the old man's grandsons to help her sink a well into that underflow, and then a second, hand-dug, timbered, patient work over 2 summers, and she had capped them and told no one, and she had banked that water like a coal under ash against a day she felt in her bones would come. Now the day had come, and while the whole valley's streams lay dead in the sun, the 2 wells on the low bottom of the slough ran cool and steady and sufficient. Not a flood, but enough for her own stock, and a great deal more besides. The humbled beggar came to her in the worst of it. He was the man who had said it first and loudest all those years ago, the fool and her money, a big prosperous rancher named Garrity, who had run the finest herd and the fastest horses and the loudest opinions in 3 counties, and the drought had ruined him worst of all, his cattle dead, his blooded horses broken, his money gone to Sutter for water that was not enough, and he came riding out to the slough on a borrowed mule because he had nothing left that could carry him. And he sat at Della's gate where Sutter had once sat, and he could not for a while make himself speak. Then he took off his hat, which he had never once seen him do, and he said, "Della, I've got children, and I've got no water, and I've got no right in this world to ask you for a thing, and I know it." And Della looked at the man who had made her the valley's joke for 11 years, and she had every reason and every right to name a ruinous price the way Sutter named ruinous prices, to make him pay in coin for every laugh. And the moral weight of that moment stood plain before her. She said, "Come in out of the sun." She watered his mule. End quote. She filled his barrels from the well he had not known existed, and when he reached for what money he had left, she closed his hand over it and said, "You'll pay by hauling. There's work enough for everybody now, and a man is worth his labor." And Garrity, that big, proud, ruined man, put his face in his hands at her gate and wept, and it was the beginning of the turning. Water the wells ran through the valley faster than the drought had, and the whole desperate country understood in an instant that the fool at the slough held water when the consortium's price had bled them white, and Sutter understood it too, and Sutter moved to crush it. He called the gathering at the Willow Fork Livestock Hall, the great meeting of the whole valley in its extremity, and he meant to bend Della's water to the consortium's fist as he had bent everything else. And so we come round again to that hot hall where this began. 200 men with their hats against their chests. The empty auctioneer's stand, the small gray woman on the low platform, and Royce Sutter standing before them, all in his good coat, making his case in a voice gone reasonable. He proposed, he said, a solution for the good of all. The consortium would purchase the Renner wells and the Renner land outright, would manage the water fairly for the whole valley, would end the crisis, and he named a price to Della before them all, a great price, the largest yet. and he spread his hands and smiled at the desperate crowd as a man bringing salvation. And then Royce Sutter made the small fatal error that greedy, careful men make, the overreach of a man too sure. To press his case to prove the value of what he offered to buy, he stood before the hall and recited the exact yield of Della's 2 wells, the precise gallons by the day, the depth of the timbering, the very count of the timbers, figures no living soul had ever been told, figures Della had never spoken aloud to anyone. Figures a man could only know if he had crept onto the slough in the dark and measured what she had banked in secret. The hall went quiet in a new way. Della let the silence hang. Then she said, in her plain carrying voice, "That's a close count, Mr. Sutter, for a thing I never told a living soul. How is it you know the number of my well timbers to the one?" And Sutter's mouth opened, and no reasonable warm word came out of it, because there was no answer that was not a confession. And every man in the hall understood at once that the consortium's agent had been spying and scheming to seize the one water the valley had left, and the warmth curdled off him for good, and the room turned. Della stepped forward. She said the wells were not for sale. She said them plain into the hush. Not to the consortium, not to any Eastern board, not to any man who would set a ruinous price on the life of his neighbors in the worst of a dry year. Pico. Sutter began to speak of leases and rights and the law, and Della said over him, quiet and hard, "The water on the slough belongs to the slough, and the slough belongs to this valley, and here is my price." And she named it. She said that any family that needed water could come and take it, and would pay, not for the water, which was not hers to sell any more than the rain was, but only for the hauling and the keeping of the wells, a fair wage for a fair labor, the same as she had told Garrity, near enough to free that no ruined man in the county would go dry for want of coin. She said she would rather have neighbors than money, having tried both. And she turned her calm, dark eye on Royce Sutter, the same steadiness she had first seen in a crooked colt at an auction 11 years before. And she said, being right was always going to be its own reply. "Mr. Sutter, I only had to wait for the dry to say it for me." The reversal came all at once, the way such things come after long restraint. Garrity was the first to move. That big ruined man stepped up onto the low platform beside her and turned to face the hall and said, "This woman watered my children when I had laughed at her 11 years, and any man that stands with the consortium against her stands against me." And he put his hat back on his head, which was its own kind of statement. And then the hall moved, the whole 200 hats going back on, men turning their shoulders to Sutter and their faces to Della, and Sutter stood alone in his good coat in the middle of a room that had belonged to him an hour before, defeated not by force nor by law nor by any weapon, but by simple decency laid bare against his greed. And he gathered his papers and went out into the killing sun, and the consortium's grip on the valley broke that afternoon, because a fist needs a hand around it, and the valley had taken its hand away. The rains came that autumn, at last, breaking the dry, and the streams filled, and the seeps ran, and the grass came up again, though the whole valley remembered now that the grass lies, and only the deep water tells the truth. Della's wells kept running through it all, and the valley kept its bargain, hauling and keeping and paying its fair wage, and no family went dry. Garrity rebuilt his place with Renner horses under him, sound calm horses that had held their heads when his blooded fast ones broke, and every working outfit in 3 counties now bred to the line, so that the crooked colt bought for $28 became the sire and grandsire of the best working horses the country ever knew. Prized for the one thing that cannot be bought or beaten in, the calm, honest mind that Della had seen in a scared yearling's eye when every other man in the hall saw only a lame thing fit for dog meat. Steady lived out his years in the low bottom of the slough, gray and gentle, with the boy Tomas grown tall beside him, and he died old in the deep grass, and Della buried him herself on the high ground where he could be seen. The old man came down one last time near the end of that year, past 80 now, and slower than ever. And he sat his sound mare at Della's gate, and looked over the heeled bottom at the mares and the sound calm foals and the two capped wells, and he did not say much because he never did. He said, "You heard it." That was all. You heard it, when the rest of them were too busy talking. And Della, who was no longer a woman alone in that valley but a fixture in it, respected and belonging, leaned on the gate beside the old man, and watched a new foal she had named Nothing Yet, a foal with a calm dark eye, and 4 sound legs, and the whole crooked colt's blood running quiet in its veins, and she said, "The ground remembers." And the old man nodded, and rode home up the ridge in the good rain, and that is the end of it. Save to say that the fool and her money built the only thing in that valley the dry could not take, and the valley never called her a fool again.